Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and I'm guest hosting for Jordan Cheriton today on Status Coup. I would like to thank Jordan for inviting me on to Status Coup to do this. He has been a longtime supporter of my work and journalism. My name is Kevin Gosztola. I am a editor and curator of the Dissenter newsletter at thedissenter.org, where I cover regularly whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy. And I'm a longtime reporter on WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's case. You may recognize me. I don't know. Unfortunately, I didn't have the clip handing, but at one point, as a dad, I came on this broadcast and you could hear my baby making noise, and I had to pause and leave. And then everyone was introduced to my daughter, and she spent some time as we wrapped up the segment speaking about Julian Assange. It's good to be with you here, and we're talking about some positive news. I know Status Coup has been covering. I know Ron Placone covered this live and had a chance to address that Julian Assange was free, that he had left Belmarsh. I'm going to just show you this because I've spent some time on this case. I wrote the book Guilty of Journalism, the Political Case Against Julian Assange. Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg were very kind enough to endorse the book, and others like Ryan Grimm and Medea Benjamin and Stefania Marizzi, who you probably don't know, but she's an Italian journalist that has done some great work on Julian Assange's case. At the bottom of the hour, I'll be having a friend and colleague, Chip Gibbons, join. He's a Jacobin contributor who has written about Julian Assange's case, covered in great detail, done some work for Defending Rights and Dissent. He's the policy director for this civil liberties organization. Before we get going, though, just take a moment, make sure that you are liking this video and sharing the video. Make sure that you are supporting Status Coup in whatever way possible, because we need people who support independent media. Of course, Status Coup, one of the only channels that goes out to locations that are part of the fault lines when it comes to the class war, when it comes to fighting environmental destruction and challenging social and economic and environmental injustice. With that, let's get going here. Just to lay a basis here for what I'm going to show you first. As we go through this first half hour, I plan to break down what are basically the main items you should take away from the plea deal. There was news that came from the press briefing in Canberra, Australia, where Julian Assange landed. And we'll get to that. But before that, there was a plea hearing and a sentencing hearing that happened all at the same time. And it happened in a courtroom, in a territorial court in the Pacific Ocean. So you think of like the United States as an empire. We have these little commonwealths or territories throughout the Pacific Ocean that we've held on to. And I think primarily they've been held on to so that the US military can use them for outposts, so that they can engage in, operations to counter China and, other enemies in Asia that have been designated enemies by the United States. This court in the Northern Mariana Islands was where Julian Assange was brought to. And he was brought there because, as part of the agreement, when they established the plea deal, he refused to go to the continental United States. So he was brought to the Northern Mariana Islands. He landed there after a long flight. It did make a pit stop in Bangkok, and he left Belmarsh on June 24th. It was around 5 o'clock in London time. And then he traveled on and after being in Bangkok for a short amount of time, landed in the Northern Mariana Islands. It was in Saipan. So Saipan is where the court is located. And there he entered the court, and he had the type of proceeding that you typically have when you ink a plea deal, when you agree to a plea deal with the US government in these cases. So the hearing was two parts. The first part was going over the plea, which is he pled to conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defense information. And as they went through that, there were certain details from the US government in relation to this case that were remarkable. But first, before I go too much further, I want to tell you that the judge in this case, her name was Ramona Villagomez Manglona, that she sat there hearing from the people in the courtroom who were presenting the government, and then U.S. attorney, the U.S.-based attorney for Julian Assange, Barry Pollock, were presenting the different aspects of the plea deal to the judge. The judge's role was to approve this. So it had to be given her stamp of approval before Julian Assange could be a free man. And as part of that process, I have the recording. I have a clip from the recording of the court proceeding. We can hear Julian Assange himself. And as part of this, the judge asked him, "What did you do?" And it's required for the person who is pleading guilty to state, for the record, how they understand why they are being convicted. And so here's Julian Assange speaking, and then I'll tell you what I think about this remarkable exchange between the judge and Julian Assange.
There are absolutely no restrictions on Julian.
Oh, sorry. Can you play the clip for that's marked Assange hearing? It's a little bit. It's less than a minute, and I sent it to the email. But if that's not working, that's okay.
I just have the 3 clips in the email, the 2 briefing, and then that other one.
There should be another email there, Colin, if you're able to grab that. Did it go through with?
Oh,
do you see it down there?
It went into my spam. Give me just 1 second.
No, that's all right, everyone. Thanks for your patience. So what I'm going to show you is just absolutely incredible to me, because Julian Assange is going to state his crime, and I think you'll be able to tell how absurd it is that Julian Assange had to enter this into the record. I just don't want to give it away entirely, because I want you to feel what I felt when I heard Julian Assange sitting in this courtroom. So here we go.
I'm asking you to explain to me, what is it that you did that will constitute the crime charged?
Working as a journalist, I encouraged my source to provide information that was said to be classified in order to publish that information. I believe that the First Amendment protected that activity, but I accept that as written, it's a violation of the Espionage Act statute.
So you had certain belief, but you understand what the law actually says as well.
I believe the First Amendment and the Espionage Act are in contradiction with each other, but I accept that that it would be difficult to win such a case given all the circumstances.
That's simply remarkable to me, because he is pleading guilty to journalism. And as someone who used that as the title for his book and the umbrella for presenting all aspects of this case, going through the different charges, unpacking the allegations that were leveled against Julian Assange, the fact that he gets to the end of this saga, he's in a courtroom and a judge asks him about what he did so that he'll take responsibility for it, which is what you do when you're pleading guilty. And then she can move forward and issue a sentence. And then she can sign off on the plea deal that is agreed to with the US government. It was just astounding. And what he's describing is journalism. What he's describing is standard news gathering activities that are practiced by reporters every single day in the news media, from New York Times, Washington Post, all the way down to the smallest independent media, including someone who just has their own Substack and goes around trying to dig up scoops. So that was something I wanted to make sure people understood. The plea deal was essentially that Julian Assange would be granted time served. There was no additional time. There's no probation for Julian Assange. There's no further punishment for Julian Assange. And essentially, the plea deal ends this once and for all. But we'll come back to that. One of the things, as I paid attention to this case, that caught my attention was how in these proceedings, in this court hearing, I don't know if you've seen any news headlines that appreciated this moment, but during those proceedings where Julian Assange was in court, the US government came and they said that there was no harm done to anyone, that there was no presumptive victim, as they put it. Nobody died, nobody was injured as a result of WikiLeaks publishing these documents. It's quite an astounding admission by the US government after 14 years. After 14 years of insinuating and clearly accusing WikiLeaks of having blood on its hands in some way or another. And so here's this clip we're going to show now is State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who has taken on this reputation as a kind of ghoulish figure. He has these sunken cheekbones. He kind of looks like he belongs in some kind of a old Boris Karloff movie or whatever. And he would have fit in the Universal Studios monster pictures of classic cinema. But he's taken on a notorious reputation as somebody who apologizes for the violence being leveled against Palestinians by the Israeli military on a daily basis. And he frequently laughs, and he can't really control himself. But here he is. He's asked about the outcome of Julian Assange's case, and let's take a listen.
The sentencing part of the judgment, the judge noted that there were no victims of Mr. Assange's behavior, which is part of the reason that the sentence was what it was. Do you disagree with that? Do you think there were victims of his actions?
I'm not going to speak to a comment made by a judge in a ruling. It would never be appropriate for me to do so, but I stand by the comments I made just a moment ago.
What? You're not going to speak to a comment made by a judge. I mean, if he did, I don't know that he did, but that's exactly the point of my question.
Yeah, but I'm not.
Which is that the State Department has never come up, even though it was one of the prime quote unquote victims of these leaks, was never able to identify anyone who was killed or came under.
I think the point I made a moment ago is an appropriate response to that, which is just because the State Department was able to take actions keep people out of harm's way. People that
Okay,
you put in
so
harm's
tell
way
us
doesn't
what
resolve a
actions,
responsibility.
what actions did the State Department take?
The State Department at the time was able to reach out to individuals whose names
many?
were going to be, I can't tell you that, it's almost 15 years ago, Matt, I wasn't here.
Well, I know,
but
I mean,
I know,
look,
but
The
I can.
case has just come to a close. You
But
would think that, someone
I
would have-
cannot give you a full account of something that happened almost 15 years ago, but people that were here will tell you that the State Department went to great lengths to reach out to people whose identities were exposed and get them out of harm's way. And the other point I made is that it does, when something like that happens, it does chill the ability of American personnel to build relationships with people and count on the fact that the information they provide us will be held
doubt.
confidential. So it is not just a harm to, or potential harm to the safety and security of those individuals. It's a harm to American diplomacy.
All right, so that was Matthew Lee of the Associated Press. He's been there a long time. He was actually in that briefing room. He's been asking questions of spokespeople who are paid to lie for I don't know how long, well over 15 years, I think. And so he's very good at questioning someone like Matthew Miller, and he knows that not a single person was killed. And what Matthew Miller is saying is, first off, ridiculous. There are plenty of cases that if the Justice Department has finished their work, you can comment. And so all along, the excuse for not commenting on Julian Assange as a foreign policy issue, as a issue of global importance, Matthew Miller had told reporters he couldn't say anything because it was an ongoing case. Yesterday, there was an attempt by several reporters to get Matthew Miller to comment on the plea deal. He said it's not yet resolved. At that point, the hearing, which is where that clip came from that I played of Assange, it had not taken place. Technically, it was not resolved. However, the plea deal had been entered into court, and Julian Assange was granted bail by the United Kingdom. He was on a plane. He left Belmarsh prison, and it truly was resolved. But okay, technically speaking, Matthew Miller was right. But now he's just being a coward. Now, not addressing the issue of Assange, he doesn't want to talk about it. I think part of why he doesn't want to talk about it is something that I'm aware of that few may recognize, which is that Matthew Miller has a past with this case. He was the Justice Department spokesperson when these documents were published, the documents that involve the war logs from Afghanistan and Iraq. He was the spokesperson for the Justice Department when those cables were published, when the collateral murder video was shared, when Guantanamo Bay prisoner files were shared. And so Matthew Miller himself gave a comment to the Washington Post about why President Barack Obama's Justice Department was not going to charge Julian Assange. And he spoke, in defense of the decision and addressed the issue of, if we charge Julian Assange, then we would have to charge the editors and the reporters at the New York Times and other publications that worked on these files. So they simply were just not going to go down the road of indicting Julian Assange for journalism. And in the past month and a half, or he has actually weighed in. And when he was asked about an appeal that Julian Assange was pursuing against extradition, he stood there and defended the case that was being pursued by the Justice Department. So it's a lie that he wouldn't comment. He only refrains from commenting on those things that are going to be difficult for him to speak about, or it's going to be embarrassing, or it's going to reflect poorly on the United States. So he's good at shuffling people away, brushing them aside so that they won't talk about the matter. And now I want to also go back in time because, he knows, so does the reporter. They both know how officials were responding to the publications of WikiLeaks. Matthew Miller can sit there and talk about figurative harm or how they took steps to try and protect people, and they shouldn't have to prove that anything happened in order for people to take seriously what was put at risk. But the bare fact is what Defense Secretary Robert Gates said to the media after these cables were leaked and published. So I want you to listen to what a military official said about the impact of these leaks.
Let me just offer some perspective of somebody who's been at this a long time. Every other government in the world knows the United States government leaks like a sieve, and it has for a long time. And I dragged this up the other day when I was looking at some of these prospective releases. There's a quote from John Adams. "How can a government go on publishing all their negotiations with foreign nations? I know not. To me, it appears as dangerous and pernicious as it is novel." When we went to real congressional oversight of intelligence in the mid-'70s, there was a broad view that no other foreign intelligence service would ever share information with us again if we were going to share it all with the Congress. Those fears all proved unfounded. Now, I've heard the impact of these releases on our foreign policy described as a meltdown, as a game changer, and so on. I think those descriptions are fairly significantly overwrought. The fact is, governments deal with the United States because it's in their interest, not because they like us, not because they trust us, and not because they believe we can keep secrets. Some governments deal with us because they fear us, some because they respect us, most because they need us. We are still essentially, as has been said before, the indispensable nation. So other nations will continue to deal with us. They will continue to work with us. We will continue to share sensitive information with one another. Is this embarrassing? Yes. Is it awkward? Yes. Consequences for U.S. foreign policy? I think fairly modest.
So there you have it. Everything that Matthew Miller is saying today is false or not based in reality. Everything that Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said back then is true. And anybody who has a knowledge of the United States and the way it exercises power understands exactly what Robert Gates is describing. He's describing how the empire functions. He's describing how American superpower works. Countries are going to interact with the United States and its diplomats no matter what crimes are revealed, no matter what abuses are shared, no matter what misconduct or underhanded dealings are revealed in documents by either a leaks website or a media organization. And that's true now. I'm not going to say it'll be true forever, but there is very little impact, very little that was affected on the part of these leaks. When you look at what changed, what diplomats were forced to do differently, because that's what the conversation is here at the State Department, nothing really shifted. We didn't have anything significant happen that you could call reform. Nothing positive. There was no awakening on the part of diplomats, which is to say they would realize that, all right, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore because we can't defend it out in the open. It's been 14 years, and I would suggest to you that if the cables from 2010 to 2024, June 2024, were leaked, they would reflect almost the same kinds of incidents that brought embarrassment and shame to the United States. And so let's go there. I want to play the rest of the clip from the State Department briefing before we move on from this. But again, this goes back to the matter of harm. and how there was none, and how the US government admitted in Julian Assange's case less than 24 hours ago that there were no people killed, there were no people injured as a result of Julian Assange's journalism.
But the fact of the matter is that you have not ever been able to identify anything tangible about any tangible negative effect.
That is a different. So I think I just did point to a tangible negative effect when people are less willing to trust the United States government. To
Okay, well, give me an example.
Information's
secret. Who was willing to?
It was I was in government at the time, and I can tell you, traveling the world with a different, a different agency, we often heard from foreign counterparts that they were. I'm obviously not going to speak to. I'm not going to speak to the exact conversations, but we often heard from foreign counterparts that they were worried about providing information to the United States government because of our ability to keep it.
Well, I remember one, having been here at the time, and I remember that Berlusconi told former Secretary Clinton that he was concerned, mainly because of what the WikiLeaks, what the cables suggested about his, activities and
there were there were more substantive and serious concerns. Yeah.
Were there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you name a
not
a person?
So
country.
I think you could see why, if the point of the conversation is someone raising concern about private conversations being made public, it wouldn't be helpful for me to then make those private conversations public in response to a question at this
15
podium.
years ago. I'll drop it.
Go ahead.
All right, so Berlusconi is the only example that Matthew Miller could remember. Berlusconi was found to be, there were details in the cables about his bunga bunga parties, as they were known. These basically sex parties that he was having, and that was the more, risque and sort of salacious type of revelations that the media ran with from the cables that posed no threat or posed no risk to the image of the United States. So the idea that really was going to stand in the way of any kinds of relations between Italy and the United States is absurd. But then again, there were other examples in these cables that did create friction. I know that there were diplomats that were recalled who said they could no longer do their jobs. And then, beyond this, there's always been talk about how there were informants or people who were spies for the United States who had their names revealed in the military incident reports from Iraq and Afghanistan that were published by WikiLeaks as the Afghanistan war logs and then the Iraq war logs. And at no point has anybody ever been able to demonstrate that people were killed as a result? And I know from covering, I was one of the few reporters who went and traveled to Fort Meade, Maryland, where Chelsea Manning, the source of these documents, was put on a trial. And during that trial, there was a higher ranking military officer who was on the stand testifying. And a military prosecutor asked him to speak about how the Taliban had been involved in executing an individual who was named in the WikiLeaks documents. And as they got to talking, the defense, the lawyers who represented Manning, objected and had the judge stop the proceedings. And they said that it's our understanding that, in fact, that person was not named in the documents. And in fact, what the extremist group there, the Taliban, was doing was just trying to create panic and chaos by saying that this person was in the documents when, in fact, as they looked and checked, they could not find that person's name in those files. And so the judge actually scolded the prosecutors for trying to plant false information or inject false information into the proceedings, something they knew was not true. And they were told not to bring it up ever again during the court-martial, during the trial against Chelsea Manning. And so to this day, 0 people. And And we know that it's 0 people because now the U.S. Justice Department has put its stamp on that fact by telling a U.S. judge during these proceedings, the final proceedings in Julian Assange's case, that not a single person was harmed. So we could talk about figurative harm if you would like to, but I don't think it's fair. It seems rather unjust to do to Julian Assange what was done just because people possibly, maybe could have been hurt or killed. And it's extraordinary to think that there are those elites, both in national security agencies and also in Congress, who would accept that someone's life could be destroyed extensively the way Julian Assange's life has been destroyed just because there was some figurative, abstract possibility that someone could have been hurt if the State Department or the U.S. military didn't take some action. And there was a moment when WikiLeaks lost control of these U.S. diplomatic cables. It wasn't their fault. I won't run through the entire ordeal, but Julian Assange got on the phone and contacted the State Department and warned them that there were people who are named in these cables, and we haven't published these cables yet, but they're about to be available on the internet, and we haven't taken steps to make sure that those names were removed. And so if you need to recognize this is an emergency and you need to take action. And I don't think the State Department truly appreciated what was happening at that point when Julian Assange is making the phone call. The files had been known as leaked files for, I think it had been about a year. They had plenty of time to take action to protect these individuals. So, that's the other thing is the State Department, the Pentagon, they know that these files have been leaked before they're published by WikiLeaks, and they've got time to protect people, and they have time to prevent harm. And so that's why those people are not at risk. And that's also why when someone's engaged in investigative journalism that relies on leaked documents, you shouldn't be held liable for what might happen to those people who align themselves with the U.S. government, who do take these risks. I mean, the U.S. government should know that they are putting people in dictatorial countries or countries with authoritarian regimes. They're putting those people at risk. And so if they aren't able to keep documents secure, if leaks happen, then that's their responsibility to take care of their personnel, to protect their spies so that they are not affected. So in a moment here, I believe Chip Gibbons will be joining the broadcast for the rest of the show to discuss. Yeah, Chip says he's here right now. If you'd like to bring Chip in, we can have everyone meet Chip. I've been rambling and going through all of the details here with people from the proceedings that took place in Saipan. But to introduce you, Chip, Chip is a Jacobin contributor. He's also the policy director for Rights and Dissent. And he traveled to the United Kingdom, to London, to cover the request for an appeal hearing. It wasn't an appeal hearing yet, but he knows about something that I want to raise here before we I have one more clip that I want to play of Julian Assange's lawyer, Barry Pollock, the attorney he had in the United States, speaking about the terms of his plea deal. But before we get to that, the timing of this plea deal and how it's my understanding that in the last, I think this is something that Barry Pollock speaks to, but this appeal hearing that was scheduled, there was an appeal hearing scheduled for July 9th and 10th, and it was going to deal with this issue of the First Amendment. And part of why I'm having you on as a guest, Chip, is because I wanted you to describe for viewers what was going to be the issue that would be discussed, and why the United States would not have wanted that hearing to happen, because Barry Pollock, Stella Assange, others have pointed out that the Justice Department recommitted itself to securing a plea deal after this appeal hearing was granted. So there was something they were concerned about. They were concerned about the High Court of Justice in the UK having a hearing about the First Amendment in the context of Julian Assange's case.
Yeah, so I was in London twice this year. I was there when they had 2 days of arguments about whether or not, I think it was their 9 grounds for appeals were arguable. Having watched them argue them for 2 days, they seemed quite capable of being argued. But they rejected most of the requested grounds for appeal, except for 3. One was about the death penalty. There was no death penalty assurance given, and the U.S. gave a death penalty assurance, which the defense accepted later on. The other 2 both came from a comment made by Gordon Kronberg. Kevin knows I hate Gordon Kronberg very deeply. People watching perhaps don't know this. Gordon Kronberg is a national security prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia. He, at one point in time, I believe a Muslim defendant asked not to be forced to testify before a grand jury during Ramadan, a holy day. And he made a number of interesting comments, including they can kill each other during Ramadan. Why can't they testify? And accused them of the Islamicization. I don't think that's a word, so I don't feel bad about mispronouncing it. Islamicization of the Justice Department, having not being forced to testify on a religious holiday, a new concept in the United States. And he also was the prosecutor in the Daniel Hale case, where he compared Daniel Hale to a heroin dealer. Horrible human being. You're muted, Kevin.
Daniel Hale was a drone whistleblower.
Yes, I'm sorry. Daniel Hale was a drone whistleblower. One of the most outstanding people there is, and just watching him drag his name through the mud like that was disgusting. So at one point during this proceeding, Gordon Kronberg submitted an affidavit to the British courts about what a fair time Julian Assange would have in a U.S. Court being tried under the Espionage Act, and to stress how fair it is. I believe he was referencing testimony from Kerry Shankman, the Espionage Act expert. He said Julian Assange could challenge the Espionage Act's constitutionality under the First and Fifth Amendment, arguing it was void for vagueness and, press freedom. Why, if you can challenge the Espionage Act as being void for vagueness and violating press freedom, are you bringing this prosecution, you might wonder. So then Kronberg chimes in his affidavit. Of course, the U.S. government has responses to those. And they made a number of responses, including that as a foreign national operating overseas, Julian Assange might not have First Amendment rights, at least with respect to national defense information. Now, this comment from Kronberg became the basis for 2 grounds of appeal. First, that that Julian Assange would be prejudiced as a foreign national, and second, that Julian Assange would be deprived of I think it's Article 10 rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm not a European law expert, which they said were analogous to the First Amendment. And I want to take a step back for a minute and point out that most of the Article 10 arguments put forward by Assange's lawyers were the ones we associate with this case, that it is a violation of free expression to prosecute a journalist for doing journalism, for exposing war crimes. All of those arguments were rejected by the British court, which found it was A-OK to prosecute a journalist. They ruled 15 of the 18 charges had no nexus to press freedom. That is absolutely false. That is absolutely a lie. And they said the remaining 3 charges that did have a nexus to press freedom, the pure publishing charges, where he published State Department cables, Iraq significant activity reports, and Afghanistan significant activity reports, known as the Iraq and Afghan war logs, or the Baghdad war diaries, were not in the public interest because they contained the names of U.S. government informants. So no free expression problem, put him in jail. But they said he had to at least be able to rely on the First Amendment. Not that he had to succeed, but he had to be able to rely on it. And they told that the U.S. government, Assange would be granted an appeal on these two arguments unless they offered assurances. They wrote what the assurances were supposed to be, and in the past, assurances have not been allowed to be challenged, right? We just accepted them as fact. So they telegraphed to the U.S. government what to say in order to have the British courts rubber stamp the prosecution or extradition. So at this point, I'm horrified. I'm like, oh God, they really want to extradite the persecution of a journalist, and Gordon Kronberg just cannot stop running his big mouth, and has made the job of these two poor law lords. They're lords, right? These my lord, my lady. They wear wigs and call each other my lord, my lady. It's very much like trial by Renaissance fair. He also had an iron cage in the courthouse in case Julian came to court. He was too sick, having broken his ribs. But they literally had an iron cage in this courtroom that looked like it was from medieval times. They wore wigs. They call each other my lord, my lady. There are many lovely things I liked about London. I would not want to be tried in this like castle where they wear wigs and put you in a cage.
The other courthouse that was linked to the prison where Julian was held has a glass box in it.
That's much more modern.
Yeah, but still a cage. But still cage-like.
It's terrible, but the images of the iron rot cage is just a little bit too much. So and they telegraphed to the U.S. government what to say, and we all thought they were going to rubber stamp it, and the U.S. government couldn't even do that. They said he could seek to rely on the First Amendment, and then they didn't promise. They never promised not to raise the argument that that Assange has no First Amendment rights. They didn't promise that. And then they say, we can't make any guarantee because a court will decide it. And that is true. The last part is definitely true. But I absolutely think if they were less hubristic, they could have done a better job on the assurance and probably gotten a rubber stamp. I don't believe the court issue sunk it. And they have this hearing, and they're making these bonkers arguments about the U.S. 14th Amendment that has no relationship to anything. And they're claiming Julian Assange is not being discriminated against on the basis of nationality, but on citizenship. And in my favorite line from the UK lawyers who represent the U.S. in these proceedings, I will quote verbatim, he's not being discriminated against because of his nationality, but because he is a foreigner. A sentence that makes complete sense to an average.
All right, so the extradition.
Yes.
So under extradition law, or even just between the United States and the UK, it's supposed to be that you won't be prejudiced based on your nationality when you're extradited. And so the High Court of Justice was finding at least one issue that was worth arguing in a court, and they scheduled this hearing. And it seems the United States was afraid that they would have some difficulty during that proceeding, or I'm not really sure what they wanted to avoid. But let's just pause here. You're here for this deep dive. We've got about 15 more minutes I want to take before wrapping of this deep dive into what unfolded with this plea deal. So I have one clip I want to show. This is Barry Pollock, and I can tell. I'm going to tell the producer here when to stop. But here he is in Canberra, Australia, during the press conference.
Speaks to the terms of the plea deal.
There are absolutely no restrictions on Julian. The case against him is over. There is no gag order. There are no other restrictions. He is going to be able to go back to whatever life he chooses to build with Stella and his family. The negotiations were a protracted process that went on for several months, sort of in fits and starts. We were not close to any sort of a resolution until a few weeks ago, when the Department of Justice re-engaged, and there have been very intense negotiations over the last few weeks. one thing we were very clear about was that any resolution would have to end this matter, and that Julian would be free, that he was not going to do additional time in prison. He was not going to do time under supervision. He was not going to do time under a gag order. So that was one absolute requirement. Another significant point of negotiation was where the plea would be taken. Julian did not want to come to the United States in any form. Ultimately, obviously, we negotiated Saipan under conditions where he would be released in the UK. He would come to Saipan not as a prisoner of the United States or of the United Kingdom, and that we would come in and leave on the same day, which is exactly what happened. And other provisions of the plea that were very significant. The United States agreed that they are not going to bring any other charges against Julian for any conduct, any publications, any news gathering, anything at all that occurred prior to the time of the plea. So even if he had prevailed in the extradition proceeding, that would have just resolved this case. This resolves any possible case that the United States could bring against Julian for any subject matter. So that was obviously very significant to us.
You can stop there.
Thank you.
Okay, so Chip, that's something. The specific part that I would like you to address. You know, there are many things which we could comment, but uncharged conduct, any alleged uncharged criminal conduct from the past 14 to 15 years. No possible case. It was part of the negotiations that the U.S. would not bring further charges against Julian Assange if he was freed into Australia.
That's really huge. I mean, there was always fear that the U.S. government could bring charges against Julian Assange related to Vault 7. Vault 7 were these secret CIA hacking tools. I guess he's no longer an alleged source. The person who was convicted, oh shoot, I might disappear for a minute, but
that's okay. I'll cover for you if you want to come back.
Let me finish this. Okay. This. The person who was convicted for Vault 7, but who denies it, got a draconian sentence.
Alert from low battery.
Thank you, low battery. The worst Espionage Act sentence ever given. And there was Vault 7 were the CIA secret hacking tools. The CIA was so incensed by them that they plotted to kill and kidnap Julian Assange. Other uncharged conduct. Obviously, people have made a lot of allegations against Julian Assange on the internet. I don't think there's anything else legally the U.S. government could actually come for him from besides Vault 7. He was never charged for the DNC revelations. He was sued civilly. A judge blocked the suit because of the First Amendment. Mueller investigated, found nothing to charge. The DNC revelations are very different than the Manning revelations in that they're not national defense information. So there is an unquestionable matter of law that with non-national defense information, a reporter can publish it, even if it's illegally obtained, unless that reporter participated in the legally obtaining it. There is zero evidence that anyone has ever found, CIA, FBI, Robert Mueller, that Assange was involved in any sort of illegal attempts to obtain the DNC materials. So there's no criminal case there. There's a lot of weird stuff in the final indictment with the computer fraud and abuse case, but I think that would have been out the door by bringing it in the narration. So I would say this resolves the Vault 7 thing. You talk, Kevin, and I'm going to make sure I don't disappear.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Chip, because as you were saying, in 2017, there were these publications of the Vault 7 materials. It is what sparks the CIA to believe that they would like to, that Mike Pompeo, who's CIA director, and then others, they would like to seek revenge. They target WikiLeaks. We know that they're using as an operation that they can work through. this outfit called Undercover Global, UC Global, and it's a Spanish security company run by David Morales. And there's some connection to Sheldon Adelson, who, Morales comes to the Las Vegas Sands Casino. Some kind of an arrangement is worked out where there's a security agreement that can provide cover for the operations that are targeting the embassy, the Ecuador embassy. So Julian Assange is living under political asylum from 2012 to April 11th, 2019, when he is expelled and then arrested. And in that time, we know that there are bugs that are planted in the embassy. We know that there are efforts to try and uncover whether he's fathered any children. There are babies that are entering the embassy. Stella's targeted and harassed. His lawyers are harassed. It's possible that one of his lawyers had their offices burglarized. One of his lawyers was Baltazar Garzón. He says there were these men in balaclavas that broke into his office. He thought it might be connected to this firm. They're taking audio and they're taking video and they're sending it back to Washington, D.C., where U.S. intelligence agencies, someone, FBI, CIA, who knows how many agencies are looking at streams and footage that is being sent to them that could have material that'll help them force Julian Assange out of the embassy, but then also potentially build their case against Julian Assange, because Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, would like to bring a case and not go the direction that the Obama administration went, which is to avoid bringing charges. As we wrap up, Chip, the thing I want to ask you about, the last issue, is that the plea deal contained this really silly part that said that Julian Assange had to request an order or instruct editors at WikiLeaks to destroy any unpublished material from the documents that Chelsea Manning gave to him. And then he was going to just submit an affidavit that said he would do it. And I don't know. I'd like to get your thoughts on this part of the agreement, because I could only think of how The Guardian was made to go out back in their garage and destroy the hard drive that had Snowden files on it. And it was all just this security theater that the UK forced on the Guardian newspaper. And so again, now it just seems like there's this theater that this kind of, I don't know if you want to call it humiliating. It's not that humiliating, but they are forcing WikiLeaks to say, yeah, we destroyed unpublished material. But I don't know, what unpublished material would that be? But then also it seems rather pointless, because anything, that they had, it could be copied. And also Julian Assange is not responsible for other people who copy this information. What do you think of this?
My understanding is that the files are all mirrored on other websites, or that I'm very technologically illiterate. I have to confess that there's like a Tor type thing out there, so that there were security plans in place in case the files were ever destroyed. I know the WikiLeaks website has had some web hosting problems in the past, to put it mildly, and we've always been reassured that these documents are elsewhere and can be found. I would like to learn more from WikiLeaks, or at least Assange's lawyers, how they interpret that request and what actions were actually taken. I don't know if you've seen the affidavit or not. I'm hesitant to comment without knowing precisely what they did. I mean, it's possible he asked WikiLeaks to do this and WikiLeaks said no, right? Would that satisfy it? Or
it would seem in the short amount of time that if he just instructs the WikiLeaks editors, then he's absolved of any responsibility. I mean, how can you really be responsible for other people's actions? I mean, if that's
the whole conspiracy theory of Chelsea Manning,
sure,
Kevin, where Julian Assange is charged multiple times for Chelsea Manning giving him the documents, and then he's charged for receiving the documents as well. This is a whole exercise in charging people for other people's conduct.
Okay, I understand that that's
No, I'm being slightly facetious.
common against and common against people who engage in activism as well, to bring these conspiracy charges, but of course with that, like I'll give you the final word here. I'd like you to, as we end this broadcast, give us your overall opinion on what this means as it from a rights and dissent perspective. But my understanding of all of this really and truly is that Julian Assange and the U.S. government were engaged in a kind of transactional deal that would bring an end to all of this. And yeah, on that paper, it says what it says about being engaged in conspiracy. But and I know, based on all the time that we've covered this case, that it's not true that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning were part of a conspiracy. What is truth, and I know this because I covered Chelsea Manning's court-martial, is that she had agency, that she independently chose to submit these documents to WikiLeaks, that she was trying to give them to the New York Times or other media organizations before she went, none of them are taking me seriously, I'll submit the documents to WikiLeaks. And that's how Julian Assange wound up having these documents that upended his life, made him an enemy of the United States, forced him into this arbitrary detention, or led to the U.S. subjecting him to this arbitrary detention with their war on WikiLeaks for the last 14 years. And so, I just say to you that I think that, my viewpoint is the plea deal isn't what's damaging to press freedom. What's damaging to press freedom is that there's been this prosecution for the last 5 years that the United States has aggressively pursued. And in fact, I think the way in which they're so accepting of this resolution and is all right with walking away shows you that they're just really and truly engaged in lawfare against another person. And it is quite an abuse of power. But I'll let you give the final word.
Well, I agree. I don't think the plea deal is what harms press freedom. And I think if every single charge had been dropped against Julian Assange on Monday and he went free, much of the damage would still have been done. The damage of the 5-year prosecution, the damage of the wider 14-year persecution. I think the final word is the title of your book, Guilty of Journalism, because if you read the plea deal and you read the criminal information, what they are describing is journalism. And I agree with Julian Assange, and I agree with Barry Pollock when they say, that's one of Assange's lawyers, yes, we did these things. We believe these things are journalism. I think they are too. But under the letter of the Espionage Act, they are unlawful. The criminal information alleges Assange and Chelsea Manning committed 3 criminal acts. 2 of them are Manning giving Assange documents with the belief he might publish them. And the other one is Assange receiving those documents. A whistleblower giving a journalist documents about war crimes, thinking that journalist might publish them, is an act of journalism. Apparently, journalism is now conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defense information. Actually, that is what journalism is. In the plea deal, there was more information about the conspiracy, and you are 100% correct that, Manning had agency. There's no conspiracy the way we think about it. But part of the conspiracy is that WikiLeaks had the most wanted list. And we heard so much of this in the courtroom in February. And I think if they had gone to court, they would have made the CFAA case, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act case, similarly, that basically because WikiLeaks existed, because WikiLeaks said they would publish information without the permission of the original person, which is, how investigative journalism works. You know, you don't get the target's permission to publish negative things about them. They were soliciting people to hack information, and they were soliciting people to steal national defense information. So according to the US government, there was a criminal conspiracy. WikiLeaks existed to publish newsworthy secrets. Chelsea Manning somehow was solicited by the existence of them, not like Julian calling her on the phone and saying, hey, do this, but just by the fact that this website exists. She gave them information, making her part of the conspiracy, making Assange guilty of her giving it to him, and then Assange guilty of him receiving it. That is a conspiracy to commit journalism. Kevin, you picked the right title for your book.
Guilty of journalism.
Guilty
So we have to wrap, but I do have a quick follow-up for you, because I do imagine that the people who watch this video are wondering, now that Julian Assange is free, what does WikiLeaks do? Is WikiLeaks able to operate again? Now, that's not anything you can speak to specifically. That's not anything that I'm in a position to speak to specifically. But you do work on civil liberties and press freedom. And I would like to ask you, what's your concern now for WikiLeaks after this plea deal, after they've successfully coerced Julian Assange into pleading guilty to this conspiracy charge under the Espionage Act? The idea of any leaks organization functioning, what should we be thinking?
I am incredibly disturbed. WikiLeaks was one of the most exciting press organizations, not press freedom organizations. They became a press freedom organization through no choice of their own. Press organizations of the last 20 years. It was absolutely exciting because of the way the corporate media served as stenographers during the war in Iraq and the war on terror. And it was exciting to see people publishing truthful information. We are in a situation where there is a genocide in Gaza, where our government is lying and our so-called journalists are acting as stenographers. We have record levels of dissent in the government, probably even more so than the Iraq war, probably going back to Vietnam. And we have this horrible precedent set, both about destroying whistleblowers and both about destroying adversarial journalists who believe that if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. At this point, what everyone needs to do is to redouble the fight and focus it now on destroying the Espionage Act. I'm sorry, we want to reform the Espionage. I'd like to destroy it too. But like, because Julian Assange's comments, Barry Pollock's comments are right. What I did is First Amendment protected activity. It is journalism, but under the letter of the Espionage Act, it is illegal. The Espionage Act predates the modern First Amendment. It is in direct conflict with the First Amendment. We are in a situation where real journalists, not Jake Tappers or Judith Millers, are needed. Now more than ever, where courageous whistleblowers, Chelsea Mannings, Daniel Ellsberg, Daniel Hales are needed now more than ever. I mean, the Iraq war was awful, but the level of violence we see in Gaza is even worse. And we really, I know we have to end. I just want to say one last thing. Someone asked me in an interview recently, does any of these revelations or leaks matter when people don't even want to look up from their phones? The U.S. government thinks they matter because they went through this great length to destroy Manning, destroy Assange, destroy WikiLeaks. The Israeli government thinks it matters because they're shutting down Al Jazeera, they're assassinating journalists, and our own Congress wants to ban TikTok. And I've seen some pretty awful food TikToks, but that's not why they're banning it. Because they think it's making people humanize the Palestinians. The governments of the world believe the truth matters, which is why they go to such great lengths to silence it and destroy those who tell it. And we have to defend the right to speak the truth.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chip. I would just take a moment here to wrap and say, Chip Gibbons is a contributor to Jacobin Magazine. I presume you're still working on your article on the plea deal. You should look for that when Chip has it completed and it's published at Jacobin. My article, and I have another one coming, those are up at the dissenter.org. Once more, I'm the author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. I'm proud to say and relieved to say it's a history book now, and I don't have to use it to try and help people free Julian Assange. And then I will just say thank you to Status Coup and Jordan Cheriton for inviting me on the broadcast. Thank you for letting me be on the channel as a guest to be with you all this evening. And once again, I have to express gratitude to Jordan for being one of the few shows in independent and progressive media that regularly paid attention to the Julian Assange case. There are other progressive media shows that spend too much time on electoral politics and sometimes not enough time, or also a lot of times they don't spend enough time on the issues that we face. So I thank Status Coup for always being engaged with those things that are truly behind the injustices that we experience every day. So with that, we must conclude. Thank you all, and you all have a good evening.